Good morning, good afternoon, welcome. Today we are talking about Rasmus Rask, who is one of the pioneering figures in Indo-European linguistics. The genesis for this video is, so on my ABLAT video, somebody had asked me, why do we say like vowel grades? Where does that come from? And I thought, well, yeah, there are these conventional terms that are used, and it would be interesting to go back and say, well, what was the first time that this term was used? What did it mean? What language was it used in? And then how has it evolved? Whereas that was sort of a very large task. And it might be more interesting and easier on me to break it into little pieces and just take little moments and figures from Indo-European, from the development of Indo-European studies and talk about those. So that's what I'm doing. Today I'm talking about Rasmus Rask, who I am fond of. He just seems like a really appealing figure. He was born in 1787 in the village of Brandekilde on the island of Fyn in Denmark. And unfortunately, because it was in Denmark, I'm going to struggle so much trying to say any of these words, so just bear with me, please. His father was a village tailor, but he was also known as a wise man and sort of a healer doctor. So he did have, a degree of learning for his social context. But Rasmus Rask, was able to go beyond this. When he was 12 or 13, he was sent to the Latin school at Odense, where he was able to combine his own natural intelligence with a very good education. And he really was known for his very driven curiosity. One teacher described him as a heuristic genius. So he just had this very strong urge and will to discover. And when he was, I think, 17-ish, he began to study Old Norse. And you have to imagine that he had much less access to didactic materials than we would have today. So he had, I think, some information about the grammar, vocabulary, etc. But what he was mostly working with was a copy of the Heimskringla, which had a parallel translation into Danish. And he was working with that, systematically writing down occurrences of words, the quotation that it was found in, and from this deriving his own sort of grammar and dictionary. He complains that he did not have access to very good dictionaries or grammars. So he was sort of figuring it out pretty much on his own. While still at Odense, he met Johann von Bülow, who would become his major benefactor. This was a former master of the court who was also very interested in Old Norse studies. And in 1807 or 1808, Rask went to the University of Copenhagen and began studying theology. He was more interested in linguistics, but theology was, of course, open to him at that time. But he got a job at the library working with a professor, Rasmus Rask, who would become a major figure throughout his life. And they traveled to Sweden together, and they were working on a variety of projects together at this time. Now, in 1810, the Royal Danish Academy of Sciences announced a prize essay. So they wanted somebody to explain the origin of the Old Norse language. And Rask's response to this announcement, his prize essay, an investigation into the origin of the Icelandic or Old Norse language, this is what he is best remembered for. Although he wrote a wide variety of works, this is his most historically important work. And he was working on that from its announcement to 1814, after he had been living in Iceland for a couple of years studying the language. And eventually in 1817, this essay would be presented to the king, and it would finance his travels through Asia. So after his travels in Iceland, he was working in Stockholm for a while, which was controversial as there were Danish-Swedish tensions at the time. But he was having trouble finding the supports that he wanted in Denmark. He eventually went through Russia and then traveled through Persia, India, Ceylon, and all the time he was traveling, he was studying the languages. He came back to Denmark when he was 35, and he, I guess, had a frustrating career because he really wanted to be professor of Oriental languages. This was a post that was mostly reserved at the time for Hebrew teachers who were teaching Hebrew to students of theology. But he felt like the post was getting cast over, and he was made, professor of literary history with special reference to Asiatic literature. He wasn't very satisfied with that. Eventually, though, he became professor of Oriental languages, and he could breathe freely. This was in 1831, and he died the next year at age 44 of tuberculosis. So that was a general overview of his life. Now let's talk about the prize essay. So this work, which is quite long, I have Niels Egge's translation, and the introduction to that, by the way, is my main source for the biographical information. And it's about 250 pages, not counting the introductory materials. So he goes through, he opens with some philosophizing about language in the past, and then he talks about etymology and how he defines that. He goes on to talk about various sounds or placements that he notices, so letters that are exchanged for others within different languages. And then he goes through and he lists a number of languages that have been reputed to be the source of Old Norse, and then he draws comparisons, makes vocabulary lists, analyzes a bit, and then discards most of those options. Finally, he gives what he considers to be the true source of the Old Norse language, which he calls Thracian. We do not call that Thracian anymore, we call it Proto-Indo-European. So this essay can be criticized in a couple of ways. One is simply he was using terms before those terms became standardized. So he was saying Thracian, where today we say Indo-European. He was saying Gothic, where today we say Germanic. There's a couple other terminologies that he is using that are later going to be incorrect. At the time he was using them, they were fairly new terms, so he was not breaking a standard when he was saying them. He has been criticized for not sufficiently distinguishing between sounds and letters, so he's using sound and letter fairly interchangeably. He was also a big proponent of orthography, matching pronunciation rather than matching, historical precedents. But modern linguists would say you need to distinguish quite carefully between sounds and letters, which he was not doing. He also claims that Celtic was not a Indo-European language. He thought it was not genetically related. He later went on to say, no, that was incorrect. These footnotes in place, they do not diminish the brilliance of this work. So he is very good. He points out that, language has to be studied systematically. Sound changes can be studied systematically. And you can't just compare vocabulary, you also have to compare grammar. He points out correctly that languages tend to lose morphology as they age, so a more morphologically simple language is likely to be further away from the source. He is the first person here to set out Grimm's law, so Jacob Grimm would eventually put that into his Deutsche Grammatik and make it more official, but Rask is the first person to lay down the sound changes involved in Grimm's law, which I will screenshot that and put it on the screen so you can see where he puts it, which is in Niels Egge's translation. And then I will quote this section where he is talking about the Thracian language. Again, substitute Indo-European for Thracian and Germanic for Gothic. So he says, now, if we ourselves make a renewed comparison of the Thracian language class, of whose main stem and subsidiary branch we find so many very ancient, invaluable remains still extant, with the Gothic and Lithuanian class as regards system and individual words, the thorough investigator notices nor merely a few random words resembling each other somewhat in form and meaning, but such multitude of similarities that rules for the shifts of letters can be extracted, and practically the entire language structure proved to be the same in both, or rather, that of Gothic can be found also in and derived from that of Thracian, by means of that of Lithuanian, despite the fact that one of these language classes may well have lost much of what the other has preserved, that one of them may have preserved the similarity to what is common in the other in just a few cases, or in only a few dialects, and that each of them may separately have borrowed from foreign language classes around them. So he is able to set out a lot of the substance of Indo-European studies. He is able to make very clear distinctions, and you really can see a strong heuristic genius, as his teacher called him, in this essay. So if you can find the translation, or if you read Danish, I would say this is actually a great read. I think it can be, sometimes I'm hesitant about reading a very old work because I don't want to learn the misconceptions that they had. But I think oftentimes the misconceptions can be fairly surface level, especially when you're dealing with something like this, which is a pioneering work. And the substance of what you find is so brilliant, like it's such a gem, that it's really worth reading because it tells you so much more about what linguistics became than you can get sometimes from reading about from modern sources, which don't have that same raw energy. It's really wonderful to see. It's exciting, and it's like you're seeing the bare bones of an apparatus that's going to go through the generations and become more refined and more systematized. But seeing the spark is kind of special. Well, that is my video for today. I hope somebody enjoyed it. I know it's a little different from my more general videos, but I thought it would be interesting, and I really enjoyed reading a little bit more about Rask. So have a good one.